I'm curious on the Trump administration overall. Are there other themes you think he got right, and what were some of the missed opportunities? Were there a couple of things you wish you could have done differently?
Okay. Yeah, there were lots of other things we got right. First of all, understanding that there is no such thing as true free trade in the world as we know it. It's a nice theory that every country will just manufacture and even export the things that they're the best at, will import everything else, and life goes on merrily. The problem with that is in between you have human beings, and the human beings are always trying to advance their own country's economic interests. So you get into all sorts of protective mechanisms, and as a result, it's a fantasy to think. We don't have a something like $800 billion a year deficit with China as an accident. It's partly mistakes we made, particularly letting them into the World Trade Organization without having any proper enforcement mechanism. President Clinton operated under the assumption that if they were admitted to the WTO, they would abide by the rules. Well, it turned out they didn't, but there was nothing we could do. And we compounded it by the Congress passing NPRS, Normal Trade Relations. And what that gave China was exemption from the annual review by our Congress. So it took away one of the few protective powers that we would have had. So the combination of those things and the WTO rules is what led to the boom in China. If you do a chart of GDP of China, look at the 20 years before WTO. They made a little progress, but nothing particularly outstanding. Suddenly, WTO, they take off like a rocket ship, and it was partly trade driven because they had big surpluses, and partly capital investment driven. Since then, we have invested inadvertently $10 trillion in China in net exports from them to us, and there's been another something like 10 trillion of foreign direct investment into businesses in China. So that's $20 trillion that China gained as a very direct result of actions we took and the WTO took. And now that part of the reason they're having the troubles they're having are the measures we put in the Trump administration. The other part of it, and the other thing I'm very proud of, is regulatory relief. The administrations before us seem to have two theories. One is if it doesn't move, tax it, and if it does move, regulate it. And so they were very stiff on regulation, and a lot of the regulation wasn't even truly enacted by the Congress. It was just overbearing by the enforcers, the people in the field. We were in the oil business for a while, and one day I get a call from our guy in New Mexico, and he said, "You won't believe this, but they're now insisting that I get a permit to put a porta potty on a well site." I said, "A porta potty? I mean, it's not even an invasive unit. What is this all about? There is no such law. Tell them to go to hell." And he said, "Yeah, that's fine. But then when I do go back to them for a permit that I do need, you can imagine what they'll do to me." So it was not just the fact of more and more regulation, but it gave all the left-wing people out in the enforcement area encouragement. Go after them, go after them. Trump put in a rule for every new regulation any cabinet member wanted to enact, you had to cancel 2 of at least equal magnitude. Well, we actually overall canceled 8 for every new one that we put in. And as time went on, I got more compliments from business people for the regulatory relief than for the tax relief. Because think about it, business can adjust to good news, it can adjust to bad news, but uncertainty is a paralyzing thing for business. And when you never know what new rule is going to come in, but you're pretty sure they're after your industry, like oil and gas or coal or even steel, then it paralyzes decision, it postpones decision making. The other thing with the regulations, one of the mining companies, Rio Tinto, a very good mining company, spent 10 years trying to get the permitting necessary for a huge open pit copper mine in Arizona. It would have been the world's largest copper mine. They had spent $400 million and still didn't have the permits that they needed. Well, that's got to be abusive, and this was not even an underground mine where you could make some different argument. A big open pit mine right at the surface. The Indian tribes that were in that area were all supportive of it because it was more important to them to get jobs than this, and it wasn't a historic site for the Native Americans anyway. But that kind of thing is a terrible abuse.
Were you able to fix that and help them open it up, or was it impossible by the time you guys, like, were there mines like that you guys opened?
Well, what the problem with the overregulation, every time there's a regulatory decision to be made, somebody can bring litigation in the courts. So it takes a lot of time to get the regulatory decision made, but then they can tie you up in courts with appeals and everything for years. So it's like a mousetrap. Once you're in it, you just can't get back out. So those were the things that were really retarding, in our view, the economy, and that's what we started getting rid of. So our mantra was get rid of unfair overseas competition as best you can. And in our case, in commerce, we're responsible not just for inbound traffic, but for export controls. So we were the first ones to put a lot of controls on the exportation to certain sanctioned Chinese companies of militarily sensitive products. We call them dual-use products because a lot of them had some commercial use, but also could be military use. And given that it's written into the law in China that even private companies must cooperate with the government and must share everything with them. So even if it's technically a private company, it's not really. They have in each company, and nowadays Xi has put in even more, what they call a party secretary, seemingly an innocuous position. Well, at the state-owned enterprises especially, but even a lot of private ones, the party secretary, appointed by the Communist Party, is the most powerful person in the company. So he's not under all the regulatory supervision because he's just party secretary, but they really control a lot of the businesses.